So if you could all please join me in welcoming Camille Acker.
Thank you. I just want to thank Uncle Bobbie's, thank Isabel. I am a new resident of Philadelphia just this summer, so I'm always delighted to find great spaces, especially great spaces that sell books, because I'm, obviously a writer, but also a serious book lover. So thank you to them. Thank you for coming out tonight. So I'm going to start by reading.
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
Do you want to talk first?
Whatever you decide. I'm going to follow your lead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
It's going to read, well,
I have at least 3 questions.
Okay.
Should we start with questions?
Yeah, let's do. Let's
okay.
do questions.
All right. So I think it's really important that first things first, we talk about the title. The title is pretty significant in terms of the context of the book, especially the quote at the very beginning that really sets us up gives us a little bit of context. It says, "We are looking for girls of the finest character. This is a select school. There is such a great need for young women of talent and leadership ability who really want to let their lights shine in this confused world." And that is Nannie Helen Burroughs, founder of National Training School for Women and Girls, Washington, D.C. So I guess I was curious, I want to know more about the significance of the title. And I'm curious if the title came first or if the book came first.
So, I'll answer the second question first. I started writing short stories when I was in my MFA program. And I didn't know until maybe the 3rd story that it was a collection. So definitely the stories and the characters were coming first. And then in the course of writing some of them, I feel like maybe these characters all belong at least in the same universe. And around that same time when I was in grad school, I was taking a class on Chicana and Black feminism. And I knew Nannie Helen Burroughs' name from growing up in D.C. She has a street named in Northeast. So I knew of her, but I didn't know much about her. And in the course of taking that class, I found out more about her through this speech that she delivered. And so she was, I would say what we would say now was a feminist, right? But then necessarily didn't have that label. But she founded this school in Northeast DC, and training schools were all over this country in the early 1900s. And it was really an effort by Black people to educate our own. But part of what training schools were also doing was hewing to this idea about what white people wanted us to be. Right, so there were classes that would be like, French or history, but then there were also like classes to, teach you how to cook and sew, and to keep Black people sort of thinking about these domestic roles, that obviously from slavery and beyond, that white people had been comfortable with us being in. And so I started to think a lot about what a training school, looks like, and how there are ways that we are still so trained about who we're supposed to be, and not being allowed to be ourselves, and in particular, Black women. And so, I think the other part of it for me is also these words, both Negro and girls, right? Because I think both of those terms we think of as really indicative of particular time periods, right? So like Negro is what Black people would have been called in a certain era in history, right? And a girl is a woman at a certain phase, when she's younger. But I think, especially in these last few years, it's clear that Black people are not called Negroes anymore, right? But so much of the racial oppression and politics feels very similar, and how also are we thinking about, women being in control and ownership of themselves and their bodies, and how do we also sort of question that and push back against that as though we were girls. So those are some of the layers that I started thinking about, and I was like, I think this is what this collection is called. So.
That's Really poignant. I think about the role of respectability politics in the book, in the collection, and I think that, the idea of training schools being that, for us, by us, but also with the intention of assimilating, right, and the intention of conforming to these respectability politics, whether or not there was language for that, right? And so I appreciate so much how the title is like really, it's grabbing. It's very much like, what could this possibly be about, And then you read it and you can connect each story, even if it's not taking place in a school. You can connect each story to this idea of a training school, which I think is really poignant. My next question is really about, I guess, for whom did you write this book? I think for me personally, as an Afro-Latina woman, young woman, there were all of this book was super relatable, not all of it, most of this book was super relatable for me, and I was able to grasp a lot of what you were talking about based on my experience, especially someone who went to a predominantly white high school and also went to college at a predominantly white institution, and using my own experiences of expectations of what blackness looks like and what Latinidad looks like, and being able to relate to that, and it was something that I appreciated. It was like, oh, someone gets me. I think someone who wrote a review of the book was talking about there's not many books that, like, she named, I think, The Bluest Eye, and then she named For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide, When the Rainbow Is Not Enough, right? And this falling into that category of books that are so touching for someone and who are it's like, I'm not alone. It's one of those books that you read and you're like, oh yes, someone gets me. But I'm not the only audience, right? And especially you as a woman of color writing this book, thinking about like who did you want your audience to be? Were you writing it for us? Were you writing it for you? Neither, both?
I think both.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's a real way that, in some ways, I wrote this for, like, 16-year-old Camille,
Yes.
Like, who would get to see herself on a page, like, a black girl growing up in D.C., that I could feel, the expansiveness of my experience, like, contained in this book. And then I think on the other side of it, it's definitely for black women and girls. And when I say that, I mean it's like my mother, my sister, my cousins, of being able to see ourselves, and feel seen, and that's really what I wanted, the book to be able to do. But I think in some ways I was starting with my own, how could I feel seen? Was there a way that writing a book would be able to put those experiences into context?
I think you absolutely succeeded at that. I think the book does a really good job of that. You all should buy the book, by the way. It's great. You should read it. So I just finished The Hate You Give, actually.
Okay.
And so reading this after that was so beautiful because it's a book that 16-year-old Isabel would have really wanted and needed, and I didn't realize that until I read it. So to be able to continue to broaden that stack of books so people come in and say, hey, my niece is, 16, whatever, what should she read? And I'll be like, this.
Right.
It's really, I appreciate that so much.
Thank you.
Is there a particular character or family or story that you identify most with? They're also different. I feel like you can, in a way, relate to all of them.
They are. Well, and I will say, so the book is not autobiographical, right? And yet there are pieces of myself, like over the span of my life. So there's ways that there's the character Ray in Now This, who's in her 40s, which I'm going to be in a couple of weeks, and so there's a way that she's stuck in a job that she doesn't like, is trying to like navigate intimacy and romance, and there's a way that I understand her story in terms of as you get older, trying to navigate your life, right? Like, you're supposed to get to a stage where you're like, you've got it all figured out, and yet you're still like, okay, but what do I want to do with my life? Like, what am I? So I definitely, there are, ways that I can still identify with her. But then there are also, the story about the piano competition. And I took piano when I was a girl, and also feeling that, that pull about respectability, right? Like, this is the thing that like middle class people do, and so you go do this thing, right? But then you go there and you feel sort of stung by, people who have more than you do and are different circumstances than you are, and you feel your difference come alive for the first time, and that's something I wanted to, be able to capture in that story, and I think that's still, a thing that I can feel sometimes, right? You go into a room and you're like, okay, got this, I can do this, and then you're like, oh, this person, doesn't.
It's not ready for me.
Right, exactly. It's not on my side. But in the span of them, I think, there are some characters in here who are difficult people, and even those people, I can understand. I know the source of that difficulty. Of why they seem unkind, right? Or why they're doing the things that they're doing because they're trying to belong, and feel seen and feel safe.
I think it's also something that I took away from reading it was. A lot of these characters almost like try on this respectability politics hat. They're like, all right, like let's see what happens when I conform to this expectation, and then they're like, this is really uncomfortable. I don't. This is really inauthentic. Let me not do that. And so thinking about that journey and that how each character is always like open to growth in a new way. I think is really spectacular. I want to also talk about DC as a setting. It's clear, so I know no knowledge of Washington DC. I know that each street has like northwest or like northeast attached to it. And I know that it's the capital. I've been there, on field trips and stuff like that. But to be able to kind of navigate like, this is the hood, this is the other side of the tracks, this is the, the white people, whatever. But you so eloquently, it's so easy to follow that even if you're not from DC, and so to be able to, but I guess, I know that you're from DC, and I know that you went to Howard, and so DC obviously is important to you.
all right.
HBCU, all right. But I guess you could have picked a myriad of predominantly black, or once predominantly black cities.
Yes, I know that, once predominantly black. Hurts my heart a little bit. The book is definitely, I think some reviewers have framed it as like a love letter to DC, and I think that is definitely true. And I do also think about it as a love letter to black spaces, because although, the streets and the neighborhoods, right, are DC, and, are connecting with like my growing up and, my college years, and, now when I still go back and visit my parents. But I also think that there's a rhythm and a language and a safety and quality of black spaces that I also wanted to come through. And to me, that's like, living on the south side of Chicago before, in West Philly now. Like, I think that's something that you can find that sort of heart and space in, in a lot of places, in a lot of cities. So I hope that connects for people too. Like, it's DC, but then also it's, this like larger idea of a place.
I could also totally picture this book taking place in Atlanta.
Detroit, exactly.
Chicago,
Atlanta, Detroit, my mom's from Houston, like all of those places where you can still, where it's like the soul food restaurant you go into, there's like, there's just places that I feel repeat in cities, and it's not, obviously they're not the same thing, but generate those same sort of feelings, and that,
That's great. I want to give you a chance to read from the book too.
Okay. So the story is called The Ropes. Fifth graders were savages, Cannibals, really. Devourers of each other and of Dawn. If that had been in the Watson Elementary School handbook, Roman numeral 3, beware the 5th grade savage, instead of fire code violations and summer vacation dates, Dawn might never have taken this job. She liked kids, but she didn't know about these kids. And the new girl, Clarissa, was their afternoon snack. She introduced herself layered in ruffles and ribbons without twisting the tips of her dark red leather shoes into the floor or fidgeting with the hem of her patterned dress. Instead, she stood still with her light brown arms out as if paused mid-twirl. Your name is Old Lady, Ebony, the tall and awkward girl in the last row, said. Do not speak out of turn, Dawn scolded. Ebony was queen of the cannibals. Dawn leaned harder into the bulletin board where she had stapled paper letters that spelled out, "Today is a new day filled with promise." She bought supplies for her room whenever she could, brighter colored paper, larger stencils, anything to get their attention. Jamel and Anthony, cutting up as usual, started making noises. Clarissa paused for them to finish and began from where she had started. She said her own name with reverence. Clarissa. No one interrupted the second time, but their sour faces said enough. Cannibals ate the best meat first. We welcome Clarissa to our class, don't we? Dawn said. She smiled at the girl, and though the edges of Dawn's mouth barely lifted most days, she lugged her cheeks away from her chin up to very near her eyeliner to give a real smile. You can have a seat, Clarissa. Clarissa moved away from the front of Dawn's desk and back to the metal desk she'd been placed in alphabetically. 2 months into the school year, Dawn knew all 32 names without relying on the seating or attendance sheet. Who has their homework? So we can show Clarissa what we've been learning, Dawn said. The heels of her sensible and ugly teacher shoes percussed her to the front of the room. Ebony raised her hand first. Her fingertips were as permanent a fixture in the room as the fluorescent lights lining the cracked ceilings. Her buzz, too, just as constant. Dawn called her forward. Ebony dragged her limbs and Dawn's classroom time behind her. She took a pencil off a boy's desk only for him to shout, "Hey," long after it was between her teeth. Dawn forced a smile and ignored the thievery. Ebony, if you were running for mayor of DC, what would your slogan be? Dawn joined her fingers in front of her so she wouldn't rub her temples. The place headaches started with this girl. Ebony gathered herself for the oratory. She stretched her arms so that the wrinkled piece of notebook paper was parallel to the self-satisfied expression on her face. My slogan is, because I said so. Ebony smiled and dropped her arms. The notebook paper fluttered to the ground and Ebony bowed. Her slogan could have been trouble first. Simple, truthful, to the point. What do we think of her slogan, class? Dawn asked. She layered encouragement over her irritation, soaking up the Potomac with a wad of paper towels. The children shook their heads no, and those who had started to slowly nod yes reversed course at the sight of Dawn's crossed arms and the tap of her foot. What do we need for a great slogan, class? From far corners of the room, she heard the words she had written on the board a couple of days ago. Action, optimism, brevity. Do we think Ebony's slogan encompassed action, optimism, and brevity? No one answered. Her voice had lost the screech of authority, and the children weren't sure what answer would keep them out of trouble. Class, did she? She walked toward the blackboard behind her desk and away from Ebony to write the words up again. The chalk scraped at the end of optimism. Did she? Dawn heard her desk creak, and when she turned around, Ebony was pressing a hand at the end of one long, elbow-skinned arm into the oaken surface. In the front row, Jackie stuck her hand high. She flung her wrist around as if waving off a swarm of gnats, but at least she had finally deciphered the right answer. No, Mrs. Williams, she didn't. No matter how many times she told them she wasn't a Mrs., only a Ms., some of them never got it right. Ebony raised her hand again, her fingers reaching out towards Dawn's face, and started speaking with her hands still in the air. My mother says it all the time. It inspires me to act by getting up to clean my room, because otherwise I'm very optimistic she'll give me a beating. Ebony paused as if on a sitcom and was met with a laugh track. All the classroom was a stage for her. Thank you. Have your seat. Dawn waited for Ebony's leisurely processional back to her desk before she spoke again. Remember our discussion about the slogans of the mayoral race? Since becoming a teacher, Dawn felt like she asked a lot of questions without the expectation of an answer. Carol Schwartz is running under the theme of renewal, and she includes in that her 5 F's: flight, filth, fear, frustration, and financial chaos. The students nodded like they remembered her saying that the day before, but she didn't catch recognition in most of their looks. She couldn't reveal her unwavering support for Carol Schwartz, but she instructed them in morals and ethics, 2 things the crack-smoking Marion Barry didn't have. She asked if they thought someone should be trustworthy to run the city. She asked if that person should have a record of lawfulness and responsibility. They nodded. She walked the aisles of the room to give her words weight. Intimidation was her best teaching tool. Even Dawn had to admit, though, he was running a smart campaign. The new wife, browner than the last, with natural hair closely cropped, was good for the re-election bid. A regular kind of woman, probably someone Barry should have been with all along. The wife before, Effie, was bejeweled and sunglassed with precisely styled hair. Effie didn't sit on the thin, molding comforter at a hotel while he got his fix. If she were a first lady, Dawn imagined she could be like Effie. Some Washingtonians called Effie cold, but she just wasn't common like her husband, too loud and too prone to mop up his ever-glistening forehead with a rag from his pocket. Effie even sat through his trial with refinement, hooking a rug while witness after witness told stories that wiped their feet on her life. When the FBI and the prison sentence finally came, Dawn was sure Barry would never have power or acceptance again. But 4 years after his arrest, he was trying to run this city again. All that talk he came to Ward 8 with 2 years ago, he wasn't perfect, but he was perfect for DC. Dawn now would be like Effie then, too good for any of it. A slogan lets the voters know what will happen if you get elected. This is important. History is in the making, Dawn said. She said this often to students who didn't turn in their homework or in tandem with threats at the principal's office. We're going to make our own history, she paused. Teaching was live theater. Mock election, she sing-songed. She waved small slips of paper at them. The real election is in 2 days, but we'll have ours today. Dawn had spent hours on her couch cutting the pieces of paper, first plain white paper, then red and blue construction paper, until finally she found red cardstock. Michael wouldn't help with the ballots or the voting booth. This is what she wanted, she told him, work of significance. He could be at 10,000 feet working at the Department of Ed, but she was boots on the ground. She wanted to make an impact. She wanted to be a different kind of teacher, to usher in a new era of education. But the glue holding the voting booth's cardboard edges together gave up overnight. She shouldn't have used a school-issued glue stick. A couple of the boys raised their hands and parroted back what she said about history, then raised their V's for victory. Dawn didn't think any of them knew they were imitating Nixon. Too much American political history would be a waste, but a mock election would win them for the afternoon. She dropped the rectangular pieces of paper onto their desk. They clamored to pick up pencils and pens. You'll put a B for Barry, or an S. She coughed a bit on the S, so she would have to repeat it. You'll put an S for Schwartz. Clarissa raised her hand, holding it steadily in the chalk-dusted air. She wasn't a shy girl. Dawn nodded at her. Could we say something about the candidates? Clarissa asked. The other kids rejoiced at being able to make noise, and it would fill the last half an hour before dismissal. Who wants to speak on behalf of Barry? Dawn asked. Ebony raised her hand first, but Dawn scanned the room for someone else. She believed in finding the best person for the task. Anthony had just his palm and wrist in the air. Anthony for Barry, and for Carol Schwartz? The remaining hands went down. No one wanted to speak on behalf of the Republican white lady. But then Clarissa's steady arm raised once again. Mrs. Williams, she asked. but Dawn knew it was more like an acknowledgement of an already agreed upon appointment. Clarissa. Dawn held her name aloft as Clarissa had in her introduction. She stood by her desk. Anthony did too, but Dawn let Clarissa go first. My father says, she began, that Barry had his time. He says that Carol Schwartz can do for this city what that man could not. He says that she can bring money into the city and that Barry represents the poorest ward in the city and the poorest, most ignorant people if they vote for him. Dawn thought of her mother and her sister and her childhood home on Minnesota Avenue. Still, Dawn had said as much as Clarissa's father when Barry got elected to the city council. Thank you, she told Clarissa, who smoothed and gathered the back of her dress before sitting. She was an elegant little girl. Dawn nodded for Anthony to speak. Barry has been doing this a long time, he started. He has experience. He stood still after, rolling his pencil back and forth on top of his desk. He moved his lips to speak again, but then his jaw slackened, giving up on the words before they began. Then Ebony yelled from her seat, "He's from my neighborhood. He represents Southeast, and he's black. He's done a lot for this city. My mom says people got jobs because of him. And there weren't as many knuckleheads out here on these streets shooting each other because Barry gave them summer jobs. And besides, my cousin says we can't have any white lady running this city. This is Chocolate City, not White Chocolate City." The other kids laughed and nodded to ideas they were short of information on. "We don't vote based on race," Dawn told them. They quieted down. "Or on geography." She held gazes around the room. Stern looks were her second best teaching tool. "Write your votes." The children set to scribbling on their papers. Some letters were so big that Dawn could see a number of B's even from the front of the room. Others wrote very tiny letters in the corner of their paper rectangles, but they also looked like B's. She tallied up the letters while they asked who the others voted for. Most made B motions in the air with their fingers. Excitement wasn't just infectious for these kids. It was a disease that crippled a population with its symptoms of rapid talking and air jabbing. No number of stay stills or stay calms could cure it. Dawn counted once and then again. 22 to 10. Kids didn't know anything. She laid her palms on the desk. "Barry wins," she announced. The children cheered. Ebony stomped her feet and chanted her name. The other kids followed her as they often did, the stomps rippling over the tile floor. They pounded fists on their rickety desks and raised wiggling fingers high and then higher. The whole classroom seized with cries of his name. "Elections are serious," Dawn yelled over the chants. She stood up and her chair scraped the floor in agitation. "Democracy is on the move," she reminded them. She thought that slogan up 2 weeks ago, right before the first bell. Better than democracy in action. But today, move got them out of their seats just as the bell rang. "Look, Miss Williams," Jamel said, ticking and twisting as she pleaded for them to gather their belongings. "I'm on the move, just like democracy." Dawn preferred when her mother came to their home in Shepherd Park for dinner, but Michael didn't mind driving. And this way, her mother couldn't accuse her of being ashamed of Southeast. Except there on the lawn was reason to be. A Marion Barry 94 sign staked into the small brown lawn of her childhood home. Dawn waited until after the lemon meringue pie Michael insisted that they bring had been sliced to bring it up. "Why do you have a Barry sign?" she asked. Her mother didn't even like politics. "His supporters are always walking through the neighborhood," she said. Her mother spread out the Carol Schwartz for mayor pamphlets Dawn brought for her to take to her Bible study. "Nobody wants these. People believe in Burry." "There's no U in his name, Ma," Dawn said. Burrow, Burry, like there was something he was hiding. When Dawn started college at George Washington, she worked to rid her voice of the DC accent so no one could ask her if she was from the area, not area. "You embarrassed about your Philly accent, Michael?" Her mother lit up a cigarette and pulled his menthol-flavored smoke into her mouth. She pushed her piece of pie away. "Can't say I am, Vi." Michael loved for her mother to be on his side, but it wasn't a question he should even answer. Michael's accent wasn't real Philly. He'd been a member of the Rich Kids Club, Toby and Tiffany, escorted girls from families with 5 generations of college-educated free Negroes to cotillions, studied from high school through grad school in landscape New England towns. He didn't disown Philly because it didn't belong to him or him to it. He smokes crack. He's been to prison. He isn't good for the city. Dawn tried not to yell. The curtains might complete their unraveling at the timbre of her voice. You don't know what he did for this city, LaDawn. He isn't the first black person to get into something he can't get out of. Can't say he'll be the last. She ashed into a supermarket brand cola can. This is the problem. We're always letting people off the hook. It's only November, and I've sent Ebony to the principal's office 6 times already. They probably need to send that girl back to her neighborhood school. You stay complaining about that girl. Well, I have reason. Principal Anderson told me when she was placed in my class that she might cause trouble. You wanted to teach, her mother reminded her. Because I like kids, Dawn said. She waited for Michael to defend her, but he remained lapdog loyal to her mother. At least Dawn was rewarded in other people's tender validation of teachers. They were scared of the public school children on the metro who ate bagged pickles and hot fries outside of corner stores. Her courage was rare, so she must be rare. And Dawn would rub between her eyes as if a single shining unicorn horn were there and say, it is tough, but it is so very rewarding. Except that feeling was never enough to keep her voice pliant and patient when for the 4th time she had to tell her class to stay in a straight line on their way to the auditorium for assembly. Then you gotta deal with all them kids, even this little girl you don't like. I never said I didn't like her, Dawn said. I just wish she would be better behaved. She's only 10 and she's already on a path. Her mother had kept her and her sister in the elementary school nearest their house instead of getting special permission to send her to a better school like Watson. At least Ebony had that going for her, even if she insisted on keeping too much southeast with her. I'm gonna make some tea, her mother said. I can do that, Vi. Michael got up and opened and closed battered wooden cabinets. She doesn't use a kettle, Dawn said. She stood and reached into a cabinet Michael had already opened to get out a rusted metal pot. The kettle Dawn bought her mother for Christmas 3 years ago had never been used. I told LaDawn that good enough is fine with me. She tries to forget good enough raised her and her sister. Dawn filled the pot and set it on the old gas stove, pristine from lack of use. Her mother lived on Chinese takeout, cigarettes, and caffeine. Shame on me wanting better than good enough. Tanya has even come back to D.C. Unlike Dawn, Tanya had escaped D.C. as soon as she could, all the way to California and never looked back. Once, on a visit to her sister and her family, someone inquired where in D.C. they had grown up. Tanya was quick to reply, Upper Northwest. Oh, don't be that way, LaDawn, Michael said. He only used that name to tease. Our roots are certainly important, Vi. Michael could one day run the Department of Ed or be mayor of D.C., and this was why he was annoyingly political. We're buying a house in Shepherd Park, Dawn said. This would shift the alliances, she and Michael once again together. Time was you married before you moved in, her mother said. You already living together? Don't you think you need that next step? I was married and had you by this time, LaDawn. I know, Mom. Her parents had been married for 35 years, but only 2 of those had been spent in the same home. Her mother was pregnant with Tanya when their father moved out. Over the years, Dawn and Tanya received birthday cards and infrequent short phone calls from their father. He lived in West Virginia with another woman, but her mother's mail was still addressed to Mrs. Viola Williams. Don't worry, Vi. Your daughter and I have a plan, Michael said. He sat back down across from her mother. Dawn resisted asking him what their plan was. PCPS teachers get a break on down payment costs, Dawn said. Her mother squinted in reply, but Dawn decided it was only from the smoke. They left soon after, Michael walking ahead of her to his luxury car. Ma walked Dawn to the door and handed her back a Carol Schwartz button. Dawn crossed the threshold, but her mother pulled on her arm. He putting in for this house? Her mother whispered. But Michael was too far to hear. Of course, Ma, Dawn said. They had not discussed the financials. Dawn had been so excited by the idea of their signatures together on a piece of paper, she hadn't figured out the steps they would need to take together. Okay, her mother released her. Down Minnesota, 2 boys rode a bike, one on the front wheel with his elbows hooked around the handlebars. They coasted toward the moon. Don't get yourself in trouble, Dawn's mother shouted. But Dawn didn't know if she was saying it to her, departing back, or to the boys. Girls like to play games. Double Dutch, hopscotch, hand clap, best friend today and enemy tomorrow. It was why girlhood had never suited Dawn. In particular, Dawn had never been good at double dutch. never mastered the coordination for jumping or turning. The neighborhood girls teased her about it until she gave up on that right of black girlhood and consoled herself with games of hopscotch with Tanya in front of her house. Some of those girls still lived around her mother's way, the little girls they gave birth to jumping to the rhymes their mothers still hummed in their rented kitchens. But if she had to supervise recess, Dawn would rather referee girls waiting for their turn at the ropes in the blacktop than boys kick-fighting their way through the grassy field. Today, like most days, Ebony got the rope from the activity room first, after she had pulled and bullied it out of another girl's hands. Dawn would be the adult if she had to, reprimanding Ebony by sounding out every syllable of her name Dawn's mouth could get a hold of. But she would rather the other girls who wanted to turn be dejected than have Ebony back in class acting out the rest of the afternoon. "I'll turn," Ebony declared. She was the best turner in the school after all, which she announced while waving the rope above her head. When Ebony turned, the ropes hit the ground clean, a crisp click, clack, not muddled like the turns of girls who were double-handed, a source of shame for any black girl. The coolest girls, the ones already primed for social domination, praised Ebony for her position as turner and gave the last chance to jump to the little girl Ebony must have snatched on. The rest of the group formed a loose, snaking line for their turn. The littlest girls, those in the 2nd and 3rd grade, were too cowed by admiration for the older ones. They wanted to jump too, their skinny, ashy legs wobbling with anticipation, but they might not get a chance. The rope hit the blacktop with punitive force. The accumulation of dried fall leaves did not stop the girls from double dutch. During the winter at indoor recess, they would play inside the cafeteria/auditorium/gym. The stuffy air of that space would not feel like the wind generated by those ropes in the autumn breeze. Girls who got a long turn would become flush and dewy with exertion. They dreamed as they jumped, about the boyfriend's name, about the babies, about the career the chance said they would have. The perfect life that waited for them if they could just keep their feet right and stayed off the ropes. Clarissa stood off to the side of the rope at first. The rope was doubled and Ebony looped the closed end around her waist. Her wrists swung in and out while they leaned forward. One of the cool girls, Jahari, supervised the line of jumpers, nodding to the next girl in line. Jahari was not in Dawn's class, but she was a good girl, routinely admired by the teachers. If she were found in the hall during class, no one even asked for her bathroom pass. Jahari moved closer to Clarissa and touched her arm. Dawn stepped forward, hoping to witness Jahari slipping an arm through Clarissa's, maybe cupping a hand to her ear to whisper, "I'm going to tell you a secret." But all Jahari did was elbow Clarissa toward the line of jumpers. Clarissa moved away from the insistence. Her high ponytail reiterated her refusal. Dawn understood. At faculty meetings, she spoke only when forced. Other teachers with seniority and entitlement, led especially by Mrs. Brown, used their time in a meeting to tell the principal what she wasn't doing right and what they wouldn't be doing to correct it. Dawn answered direct questions. She nodded with vigor to encourage whoever was talking, whether she agreed with them or not. She never liked to take her turn. But Clarissa finally did, with a little more encouragement from Jahari. The rope swung faster as Clarissa approached. Those swift-moving threads, dangerous, liable to welt the baby fat of an arm if you timed it wrong. The ropes advanced and then receded, and the moment had to be seized when one rope was underfoot and one sailed overhead. Clarissa tried to catch up with Ebony's dance. She could call it wrong and jump directly into the rope, or time the jumping in right but not the rhythm. The girls would make fun of her. The ropes hissed through the air. Clarissa paused in her lean. She straightened, her back, her neck, her folded arms. She waited as she had in the classroom for the moment that she was ready. Clarissa was just about to jump. The tension came back into her neck. The skirt of her dress lifted under the poised leap of her thighs. Then she stepped back, clasping her hands in front of her, and watched again. She dropped her hands and took a step back toward the rope. The tension returned to her body, and this time she leaned forward, her rear poking out to help her. But when the rope swung close to her face, Clarissa lost her stance. Ebony probably did that on purpose. "Go already, damn," Ebony said. Her hands started working overtime to turn. Whatever window Clarissa might have leapt through was gone. "Ebony," Dawn yelled. We do not curse, and we especially do not curse at people. But Miss Williams, she slow or something? Ebony lowered the ropes and gestured to the still and straightened Clarissa with her head. Ebony's small braids swayed and covered part of her set jaw. Stop it. That's not nice, Dawn said. The other girls hushed themselves. If she raised her voice more, one of the little girls would start using the trouble phrases. Ooh, you're in trouble. Ooh, you're gonna get it. Ooh, you're gonna be on punishment. She should make Ebony apologize, but Dawn would pay for that later. She had a nice afternoon of silent reading and worksheets planned. Ebony could ruin everything, devour the day's comfort. Dawn turned away from Ebony to take in Clarissa's rounded cheeks. The girl's face flexed. She probably doesn't know how to jump. She's up here faking, Ebony said. She dropped the ropes and held her arms aloft above her jeans, just like Clarissa did above her dress. Ebony put on a simpering smile and stared out to the crowd of girls with eyes rounded and vacant. A few of Ebony's supporters offered up giggles for her impression. No more double dutch, Dawn said. The group moaned as if they'd all been struck with the rope. You can't say that about me. Clarissa's firm voice exceeded Dawn's expectations. She did not stammer or lurch from word to word, trying to get the sentence out. Ebony must have heard the strength. She should learn she couldn't just push everybody around. Miss Williams, why you stop the game? I was just playing. Ebony jammed the tip of her white sneaker into the black top. She pushed her braids behind one deeply brown ear, and Dawn noticed that her face was crooked. One cheek higher than the other, one nostril drooped. Ebony was jealous, mad this little girl was better than her. Dawn almost wanted to crouch down, look her in the face and tell her so. Let her go home and think about that all night. You've got 20 minutes left. Go play something else, Dawn said. The girls herded away. Ebony trailed behind, doing some sort of dance, a victory one maybe, for getting away with her mess. Clarissa remained in her jumping spot, reclasping her hands in front of her. Dawn touched the top of Clarissa's head, and the girl looked up to smile at her. It's good when we make people do the right thing, Dawn said.
One of the things that was most poignant about that story for me was going back to the title, actually, and how it almost seems like Dawn is running a training school, not in like the literal sense, but in the idea of, you know, the expectations that she has for Ebony of like what's right, what is wrong, how to act, how to be right. It goes into the many ways that we define blackness, or the many ways that we don't define blackness, or how we should or should not define blackness, and what's okay, what's respectable, right? And so I just thought that parallel was really on point.
Yeah, Dawn is deeply invested in, you know, what people say we're supposed to be, right? Like how we're supposed to act, where we're supposed to be from, how we're supposed to sound. And she's putting those expectations on these girls.
So my mom and sister are both elementary school teachers. My mom actually teaches 5th grade also, and so when I first opened that chapter, I was like, this is gonna be really cool. Because I hear about the Ebonies at home, you know, and I hear about the students that so deeply strive for connection, right, and so want to be seen and heard and loved, and you know, a lot of times they're the ones that at 5th grade have, you know, been the least favorite student in that classroom, and so then they get to 5th grade and they're Ebonies that are disruptive and you know, I didn't say I didn't like her, I just said she's annoying, you know, stuff like that. So it's also very telling of our school system at the moment.
No, absolutely. I mean, you know, how we track kids, right? Exactly. How black kids especially are punished. Emotional
intelligence, and also how we as black people are expected to express the way that we're feeling, and what's appropriate in terms of, and also conflict resolution and skills for that, and what we learn at home and what we learn in school, and how sometimes those things don't necessarily overlap, for lots of reasons. Questions from the audience or comments, anything?
Did you write any short stories before you wrote? These are sort of, this goes on, but did you write short stories before you wrote an entire book?
I did, yes. And I definitely had to figure out how to write short stories with those earlier stories before I could get, to stories that then made sense, right? That had a character arc that was complete, that sounded like characters and not just me trying to be that character. So, yes, I definitely had to, get that education before I could write all of these.
Did you publish any of those? Can we read any of them?
Not really, no.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, a lot of those were sort of, like I said, sort of just me trying to figure out story in some ways. So more of my work that you can read are like nonfiction pieces and things that I've written outside of fiction.
Okay, I'm gonna ask more questions. I'm sorry, I have so many questions. I was curious about that. I think it's really impressive it's like an artist using two different mediums, something to be able to recognize that, I want to try something new. I'm good at this, I want to be good at something else too. So I guess you talked about a little bit of like taking the class on Chicano and Black feminism, but like this is a big leap, I guess, to switch from writing nonfiction articles to, a whole collection of short stories that are non-autobiographical. And like you said, I would, even though it's not young adult, I would definitely consider it to be a book that I would recommend to like a young reader.
Yeah, I think so. The publishing market is, so fractured into like young adult versus not, and certainly, there are some adult things. Make no mistake, but I think you were sort of mentioning like the Bluest Eye. Look, I read that when I was 16, and so I definitely, what I've said to people is like, I think 16 and over could definitely, but I consider myself a prose writer, and that's sort of what I think there was a time when I thought I was only a short story writer, and I do love the short form. It gives you a chance to sort of like zoom in on someone's life, but I'm working on a novel now. There's a play that I've worked on, so now I'm just like, okay, I'm not a poet. That's I'm definitely not that. But prose, yes, in lots of different forms. That is the medium that
This really reminded me of Interpretive Melodies by Jim Lahiri. I don't know if anyone here has read that. But Interpretive Melodies, written by Jim Lahiri, just in the sense that each story is so distinct, right? But they all have similar themes and they all grasp you, and then all of a sudden it's over and you're like, wait, like I want to know what happened to Bit. I'm like, okay, so her brother, like, did he leave?
Yeah.
Did he travel? Like, I want to know.
Well, part of what I was just saying at the Chicago event, actually, someone was saying, because I read a different story there, All the Things You'll Never Do, which is about a TSA agent, and where it ends is not in a happy place necessarily, but in a strange way, like, these characters, as I created them, but to me they also sort of live on their own. And so I do sort of think about this like arc that's happening in their lives that is beyond the scope of the story. And so in that way, like what's happened to some of those characters, like, the story comes to an end, but, is there a future that you can imagine, for this type of character, for this person in this type of situation? And I think there's a way when I think about that even when I'm ending on a note that isn't as happy, that I like to think that there's something more. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So.
Would you ever revisit any of these stories? Not in the sense of a rewriting, but in the sense of an extension?
I think I would. There's even, I was actually telling my boyfriend, the first story in here, Who We Are, was originally it was the first part in a two-part story. And there are times when I definitely think about like returning to that second part and seeing, where the story might go. you know, in a time past, you know, where I originally focused the story. So I wouldn't rule it out. Yeah.
Well, let us know because we'll let you know.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes.
Were there stories that didn't make the cut, and how did you kind of like congeal the entire process?
Yes. So there are 2 stories that were cut from this. So this, I was in my MFA program, and this was my thesis for the MFA program. And in the course of workshopping it, there was one story in particular that people were like, I don't know if this is exactly like in the same, you know, universe. And as you know, as Isabel said, like I wanted the stories to be different, you know, to feel different in form and voice, but then there was this one story that was like more of an outlier, you know, and so I ultimately was like, yeah, you know what, I think this isn't part of this collection, but that is also a story that I think one day, you know, maybe that'd be my second collection. And then there was another story that I was starting to rewrite and revisit, and then I just also felt like it didn't quite, it fit better, but it just still didn't feel like it was quite this same universe. And you know, it's not that the stories are taking place all in the same time. It's from the 80s up until the Obama era, but there is something that I feel like, you know, like I said, I think all these characters are in the same universe, if not necessarily in the exact same place. So yeah, I was like, all right, cut this one too. But you know, they're in my virtual drawer that, you know, I think one day I'll return to. Yeah.
How long was your journey in writing these stories?
So the first full draft took me a year. But the revising, I mean, I finished the first full draft in 2012. So, you know, like, it's been some years. So, and you know, and it's certainly not that I was working on it constantly, you know, over the last, years, but, you know, there were different times when I would return to it. I was in a writing group in Chicago, and so I brought the stories in, and people were like, you know, I don't know about this, maybe you should think about this, you know, and so then I started to re-engage and revise them. And then Feminist Press put out a call for women of color who had a debut work of fiction, and I was in between jobs at the end of my unemployment, and I was like, no, I need to look for a job, right? You know, but I saw this and I was like, well, maybe if I revise it one more time. And my boyfriend actually was like, no, you should, you know, take some time. And so I did. I took like another month to do another round of revision on it, and sent it into Feminist Press. So here we are.
Yeah, I'm just curious, what other writers, let's say voices, may have influenced you, and that, you know, that you could say that could maybe influence some other younger writers, I'll say, you know, younger writers, that you would say that, you know, this is where it got me on this path to sort of like inspire me, to energize me, and at the same time, are those voices, you know, seem to come through even what you're writing now?
I mean, as I said about even finding Uncle Bobbie's, like I love books, right? Like I love bookstores. I come from parents who are big book lovers. You know, there were always books in our house. So I definitely read a lot growing up. And there are, I mean, Toni Morrison is certainly, you know, one of the like original influences for me. I do remember reading The Bluest Eye at 16 and being blown away. Like, you know, I just like, oh my gosh, she's writing about black girls. Like, I could write about black girls. Like, I just, you know, and also Edward P. Jones, who wrote a collection, Lost in the City, that is in DC. I also read that when I was 16. 16 was a big year for my writing life. And actually, my father bought me that book for my 16th birthday, got Edward P. Jones to sign it, and the epigraph, like the dedication he wrote to me was so, like, helped me to be a writer, honestly, and like helped me to sort of stay with it even when I thought about giving up. So, you know, Alice Walker, I could go on, right? There's so many people who really helped me to love language. but then I also had to get to a point, and I think that this is, the journey of any writer or any creative person. Like, how can you be influenced by other people and also figure out your own voice, right? Because when I first started writing stories, I was sort of like trying to write like Toni Morrison, right? And at some point I was like, okay, like you didn't grow up in that era, right? You are not from Lorraine, Ohio, like, And so I started to have to really say to myself, okay, like what is your story? Like what is your perspective? What did you grow up in? What is the thing that you can really talk about? And so, having those influences and seeing how they treated language was really important. And I also had to say, like, who are you? What's your unique voice? And how can you bring that to the page? So.
Any other questions?
So do you think you're going to write another book?
I am working on a novel. Beyond that, I have like 4 other books in mind. So the next 5 books are in here or like on my laptop as the beginning. If not actual, the words of the book, then the idea for it. So, yeah.
I have a craft question, I guess. How did you, coming out of your MFA program, I just came out of an MFA program, so I'm trying to shake the dust off.
Yeah.
What did you do, I guess, immediately after? Did you continue to write, and how did, I guess, you come out of maybe a post-MFA coma?
Oh, yes. Yeah, so, and that also, that post-MFA life was definitely a journey in and of itself, because, coming out and being like, okay, I have to make money, right? I gotta pay these bills somehow, right? So I temped at one point, I worked at a nonprofit, I was teaching, and all the while trying to like steal, hours here and there to keep working on my on these stories and on the novel that I've also started. And one thing that was so helpful to me in that post life was having a writing group. We fell off towards the end of my time in Chicago, but for 2 years, every single month we met. And it was so valuable to be able to know that I had people I could trust, that I could bring my work to, and who would give me, good feedback, right? Like not just, oh, I know this seems fine, right? But also give me, like valuable feedback, and not, also feel like they were just criticizing, to criticize. And then it also meant even reading their work helped me to also then think about mine, like, oh, they crafted that sentence, amazingly, like how could I also do that? And so having that and having a deadline of like turning things in was really important. If I hadn't had that group, I don't know that I would have been able to get this book in the shape that I needed it to, by the time I submitted it. So I think like definitely like finding writing community wherever you can, put it together is really important.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Can I have a round of applause, please? Thank you so much for coming. I'm so glad that you got to share your work with us.
Yes, this is amazing.